Hey everyone, welcome ZDS 077, Ben Lesh. Thank you so much for joining. I hear you had a fun time with Pinewood Derby stuff.
Yeah. Literally right before this, I just got done tearing down a track. So socially distanced the Cub Scouts. I'm a den leader for Cub Scouts for Weeblos for my son, and we had a socially distanced Pinewood Derby this year because they're trying to do the best with that. So literally had a Pinewood Derby track set up inside my home and was running it over StreamYard, which is what we're using right now. And just it was something else. I've never set up anything like that before. It used open source software, which is amazing. That had almost 30 pages of documentation or something like that, which is slightly less amazing, but still awesome that it existed and it could interface with the actual hardware that had the timers and stuff in it. And it was. I was installing drivers for things on an old MacBook, and it was nuts. But we got it done, and the kids were happy with it. And I'm sure at some point when I was a little kid, I probably thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool to have my own Pinewood Derby track set up inside my house?
Is the track still set up for your kids to play with now, or have you taken it down?
No, it's so like they're so big that we had to move furniture and get stuff out of the way down a hallway, and it's
this is a renovation project.
It's like a dominant thing in the house. It goes the entire length of the house.
Yeah.
So
that's cool. I remember growing up, I loved doing the little Pinewood Derbies with the little soapbox cars. So it's cool that you're still giving your kids that even in our current
and
climate.
it's tons of fun. And the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts now are just they're not necessarily Boy Scouts. I think they're just calling them Scouts. So
Okay.
there's girls in our group too. So if anyone I think Pinewood Derby sounds fun, but it's too bad that group is like a boys group and girls don't get. That's not even true anymore. We had out of our field because it was a very small field this year because attendance because of the pandemic is very low.
Yeah.
I think we had maybe 15 cars, and out of that group we had several girls. So they're all scouts. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
That's very cool. For your normal meetings, are you doing Zoom or?
Yeah. So
Okay.
for our group in particular, I've been doing Google Meet, which is mostly just because I'm cheap. There's no really good, and you can have more visitors for longer on that, and then but most of the time people do Zoom for the big pack meetings and stuff. People do Zoom because everyone has that for school and all that now. So
Yeah, I usually use Zoom, but I was recently using Google Meet. One of the things that blew me away was their live real-time captions. That was that was really neat to see.
it's pretty nuts. I actually, so doing the Pinewood Derby thing over StreamYard, I was actually disappointed that no one was really using the chat on the YouTube thing, because I was really excited to use the feature where you can actually place text from the chat to the video. I thought that was kind of a cool thing, but
Just with the StreamYard thing, you mean?
That StreamYard feature is pretty cool. But the live captions thing on Google, that's pretty killer. I don't even know how that seems like it should be a requirement at this point for streaming chat, but especially during the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
What do people do if they can't hear and they're trying to do video meeting, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty.
I don't know, but yeah, it was cool. I think there's you can print out the minutes, it's right there for you too.
Oh
Part
wow!
of that, I think. Maybe I'm misremembering. I don't know.
That's
but
all I know is voice to text gets a lot of what I say wrong because I have certain things I say. I don't know if I have it with a Michigan accent or just a little too blue collary in the way that I speak, but it'll mangle certain things. But then I'll read it out loud what I see in the text, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I guess I could see why it thinks that I talk like that. But
that's
it just shames me into trying to pronounce things better.
Pronounce things regular.
I don't know if that's really what their goal is to shame people into pronouncing things more cleanly, but it's
Well,
mean.
it's mean. Yeah.
It is
My
mean.
wife, my poor wife, she's got a southern accent, and she has a hard time with like the Google. We got a Google Hub in our house, and it's like
Right.
it won't listen to her. It just won't.
Well, I find that Google's products and Apple's products and most other people's products work really well if you speak like a second generation college educated person from California. I think that their
Bias
tools
in
work.
tech.
I think their tools work amazing for people that, especially if you don't have kids, it's even better. So
Yeah. Well, yeah. We got a lot of kids running around too, so I get that. My daughter can speak to Google actually now, which is
great.
kind of neat. It's kind of fun
That's
to see her do that.
that's a lot of fun. So my oldest, I have this funny story about. My oldest was in kindergarten, and now she's a sixth grader, but she was in kindergarten, and we had a Google Home, and she's sitting there, and she's supposed to be doing this writing assignment where the goal was to get her to spell the words herself by like sounding it out.
Yeah.
And she just had to write like one sentence or whatever. And so she's like, hey, mom, how do I spell home? And my wife's like, well, you're supposed to try to do that yourself. So, you have to try to spell it yourself. She goes, okay. And she's like, okay, Google, how do I spell home? And it's Home. And she's like, okay, and wrote it down. And I thought it was funny.
Mom just got replaced.
Right. I was like, so technically she did it herself. I mean, there's no other humans involved in that, I suppose.
Yeah. I feel the same way about interviews, right? Like, feels like going into an interview, you're supposed to go in like with your hands tied behind your back and kind of be like,
Yeah.
It's kind of silly. I don't know.
It's super silly.
Coding without Google would be ridiculous for me, at least.
Dude, like if I wasn't allowed to Google things, I could be in an interview and someone could ask me a question about RxJS and I would vomit.
I know.
Like I'd be like, I don't know, I have to go look that up. Like,
no, I was on the Angular show recently, and they asked me about this operator, and I was like, hang on one sec. Full of RxJS.dev, and I'm like, okay, there's the marble diagram. Got it.
Yeah,
but
it's people that ask me about, I don't know. If someone's like, name all the operators, forget it. I'd get maybe half of them, and then someone would be like, "But what about this one?" I'd be like, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that one."
Yeah,
but yeah.
Well, that's cool. It's good to hear that you struggle with that too, because I'm definitely like, I don't know. So you put me on the spot for an operator, I'd almost like want to not answer, because even if I was like 70% confident, I wouldn't. The 30% would make me want to look it up, because, and maybe this gets into one of the things I wanted to talk about. It feels like RxJS, one of the powerful tools about it is how precise you can get. But there's also many different dimensions of complexity that kind of come with that. And I was wondering if we could hear from you, like, what's your mental model you come at with this stuff? Like, how do you box this in so that you can make it like a practical tool? Is that a fair question? I don't know.
Sure. I mean, I try to first of all, I only use it if I'm dealing with streaming data. Okay. Or I'm dealing with something where I want cancellation, or if there's something where I actually get an observable out of it. Like if you have complicated event coordination, it's a good use case. If you have streaming data, it's a good use case. Or if you have cancellation, observables are good, but not necessarily even like the operators and stuff. Like in that case. So I mean that for one, like if you limit your use cases to where it's strongest, it'll probably help. And then the other bit of it is I try to think of things in series of steps. And, if you're trying to compose like, oh, I need a stream of X, like start there, like just start with like of in the exact proper shape of the thing that you want. And now you got your view working, right? And then you take a step back and be like, okay, so this comes from two other streams that are shaped like this. So then you create those with of, and you compose the thing, and you see if it works. And just I always start from the end result I want, and then kind of work my way backwards, as opposed to being like, okay, I think I need this event and this event and this event, and then I'm going to tie them all in weird knots, and then I end up with the thing that I want. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's probably I think it's easier to build those things from the result backwards than it is to build
Yeah.
from some unknown set of things towards the result.
Yeah.
Especially the more complicated the stream coordination gets.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we'll put in the stream coordination aside for a bit. So I've been in Angular for a while, pretty much my whole career in front ends. I've recently been trying to get into React, and I feel like kind of that what you're talking about with starting from like the endpoint. I feel like React paired with TypeScript and just like the very basic pattern of presentational components based on props is like a really good tool for that specifically. To the point where, if I have something, I just want to display this object, but I want to create the UI for it. TSX is crazy good for that, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, you can do the exact same thing with Angular components. I feel like it's not as common of a practice. Like in every single framework that I've ever used, which is now Angular 1, Ember, and then Angular, then React, and then Angular 2, and then back to React again. Like,
Yeah.
Every single one of them, there's like this idea of what I call dumb components, which are just for doing display and maybe like some event percolation. And then there's like a component that has control over the dumb components, right? Like it has to know more about state, like the stateful components.
Right.
And React, I think, forces people into that pattern a little bit more. They still screw it up. Don't get me wrong. Like there's I think that the only reason React forces people into that is now more people are just creating a single function that is a component. And honestly, using hooks in things gets a little bit daunting and painful sometimes, in my opinion. And that accidentally, I think, forces people into being like, oh, this is a component that just does display, which is great because that's what you wanted to do in everybody's framework. But in other frameworks, people don't do that as much. I do think that, I've seen applications that are written in React where it's not quite as testable because they don't have the same dependency injection stuff by default as, say, Angular. But at the same time, Angular's got a more comprehensive set of tools around it than React. But at the same time, like the mental models in React, I think, are simpler than some of the mental models in Angular, which, Angular's got these ideas around, different selectors where you can get like child components and that sort of thing that where like in React you'd use context, and really you probably should, in my opinion, you should probably avoid that unless there's some real win to using it. But
you mean context is like a way of dependency injection? Or
context is a way of saying, oh, if for example, how like a row component behaves differently under a table component or needs to be under a table component or something like that. Like
you said row and I went to statistics, but then you said tables. So I was like, I got it.
yeah. There's a row and a grid or whatever. Like if you have a component that's meant to be a child of some parent and they've got some relational behavior, then usually you'd use context for that. Or in Angular's case, you use, the child component selectors, or I forget what they're even called. It's been a while.
Yeah, view childs,
but those,
I think.
Those things are, in my opinion, to be avoided if you can. Like, if you start getting into that, then it's like, okay, so you better be trying to write some highly ergonomic like library that everyone's going to be using. Or just stop it, because like I think you're just setting yourself up for pain later on.
Stop it. Get some help.
Yeah. Because now you've got components that are tightly, like a child component that's tightly coupled to some parent component, right? Like it can't work properly unless it's, I don't know. Well, and sometimes you want that, but I'm going to bet that most of the time you probably don't want that at all.
Well, you get into the more complicated APIs too, and I feel like you start coupling it to the developer that made it, which is probably worse. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, it's people find they get themselves in the same sort of trouble in React that they do in Angular with those sorts of things, and
Hmm.
um,
Okay. I could
I
see
don't know.
that. There's some hooks, like looking through all the different hooks, and you mentioned them being daunting. Set state and, or not set state, use state and use reducer actually seem pretty cool for some things. But some of the more obscure ones, I was trying to come up with some good use cases for them. I'm just like,
So
oh,
ironically, I worked on the Angular team, and part of what I did there
yeah,
was working on the Ivy compiler.
right.
And what happens when you compile an Angular app with Ivy is it compiles it all down to a function that essentially has hooks inside of it.
Hmm,
It is so close to being exactly the same shape as a React
interesting.
component that had actually at one point I had proposed. I was like, while I was there, I was like, well, what would happen if instead of building this to our own custom, commands or whatever, we just compiled it to like Preact.
Yeah.
Like here's
I've
Preact
heard this
functions.
story, I feel like, before.
Yeah, and like
But
it
yeah.
got shot down. They have different life cycles, and
Yeah.
that got hardcore shot down. But I mean, like, I don't know if I were running that project, which I clearly am not, and I never would, and I'm sure they would laugh at the idea of me doing that. But I would definitely aim for that because if you have
Yeah.
that, then all of a sudden Angular can handle Angular components and templates, and it can handle React components and templates,
Hmm.
and it's got a better like I think Angular tooling is overall better. And there's things like Angular material that
Yeah.
here you've got members of the core team developing components that are reusable that
Hmm.
work very well with the actual core library. Where in React you don't have that, to my knowledge.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of third-party stuff that I've run into problems with every single time I've used any of them, and but there's not anything that's like supported by React that I'm aware of. It might exist, and I just don't know.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's there's so and like the forms stuff and forms validation stuff for Angular, and there's like a lot of really impressive stuff that is done, and of course Rx integration is pretty tight.
Hmm.
Like I don't know, like it's one of those things where it just kind of is like, ugh, that could have been like the de facto thing.
Yeah.
Like, had it just had interoperability with like if you could pull in any React components to use it in your Angular app,
Yeah.
that would be
That'd be a really
something.
cool world.
Yeah, yeah.
uh, but yeah, one thing I've been when thinking about, and I had Kenzie Dodds on a couple weeks back, and he mentioned this. Um, so Angular templating and a lot of Angular code feels really domain specific, which I think might be a fairish. Whereas React feels more like JavaScript. In some ways, I agree. I feel like once you get to hooks, that goes out the window a little bit. But just paring it down to like TSX and presentational components, I feel like that kind of holds up. Um,
Right.
do you
Yeah,
agree?
I'd say. Yeah, I mean, like Angular's got convention. React has almost no convention.
Hmm.
And that's where you get into like saying something quote unquote is domain specific. I mean, when it comes down to it, JSX, you know, the only way that you can say it's not domain specific is because you can point JSX at other functions that'll do the same thing. Like for example, you can point it at Preact instead of React create element or whatever. But
Right.
like at the end of the day, like you can take HTML from an Angular app and literally just like save it as HTML and use it as HTML, and it works,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not invalid HTML. So that part isn't as domain specific. Whereas if you were to take JSX as the HTML shaped thing that it is and try to use it as HTML, it would not work at all.
Yeah.
It would be
It'd be kind
so
of a
like
mess.
arguably it's JSX is it is, I mean, not even arguably, it is a DSL for a specific thing. Like it's a DSL to represent calling functions that then build DOM nodes or virtual DOM nodes. Like it's very specifically a domain specific language for that.
Interesting.
But could you shoehorn it into something else? Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure I could make something that built observables out of JSX because it just calls functions under the hood, right? But like, is that what it was designed for? No, its specific domain when initially designed was to, represent virtual DOM implementation, right? So I don't know. It's I think they've both got their set of domain specific stuff. Like if you took JSX out of the picture and you just like everyone just used create element or H or whatever, then it's absolutely not domain specific. It's just like here I've got JavaScript and that is technically what it's doing under the hood. Yeah. But the thing that everybody glosses over is it's writing JavaScript with a domain specific language designed to write JavaScript that returns certain shaped things. Like it's I mean it's the same thing. You could say that by the same argument you could say that RxJS is not domain specific because it's just written in JavaScript. But no, it's a domain specific language around dealing with streams, right? Like someone off the street is not going to know what the hell a concat map is. Like it's weird.
Yeah.
So
that's a fair point. Well, this was getting into what the next step I wanted to go from this was like the way React handles reactivity. I feel like is very it is very domain specific. Whereas I feel Angular's, because it uses RxJS, is more agnostic. Domain agnostic. I don't know if it sounds like you probably wouldn't agree based on your previous statement.
No, I don't know. Like, so, I mean, Angular deals with observables in as far as reactivity goes, and observables can be created from almost anything.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it's still very much like, you're composing your own reactivity in Angular. I don't know. It would have to very app to app because there's some people that don't use observables at all, right? Like they'll use it they'll just subscribe to get HTTP and then they're setting and they're letting zones do the rest.
Yeah.
Where the zones bit, all that's really doing is just like, hey, I'm going to hook into everything.
Yeah.
And do some dirty checking, right? And then execute renders. And where React is more something has to explicitly do something. Like someone wrote code somewhere that either set state or, set something in a use state or whatever to like trigger a re-render or whatever it was that triggered a re-render. And like its version of reactivity. So there was a tweet the other day by someone who has really strong opinions about reactivity. In particular, that pull-based I specifically remember this person saying that pull-based reactivity had already won. This was like years ago, and like no, not really. But like this person was talking about how React isn't reactive, and it's. The reactivity of something is kind of, but like for something to be reactive, you've got to do something. You have to do things to control the change propagation in like kind of a step-by-step way, and it has to be declarative. And if you look and you squint, you can see like, oh, I have this declarative JSX thing that represents components, and the components are nothing but render functions that render more JSX things that represent other components, and then like something triggers a re-render and then it goes through and it calls all of them in a certain order. And you can control, quite literally, you're controlling change propagation when you're doing that. And, you're controlling how the data flows from one piece to the next. And, is React doing things to, manage the timing of those things? No, not really. Like it's not like it's a non-obvious form of reactivity, but it is reactivity. I don't care what you could get the world's greatest scholar on reactivity on here to tell me I'm wrong, and I still wouldn't believe him. I'd be like, okay, well, it's a really like reactive programming is a very vague, broad
Yeah.
topic, right? Like
No, I definitely
it
feel
comes
that
in
way
all
too.
sorts of different shapes. You can have it in pull based, you can have it push based. The important bits are you have some sort of declarative way to put it together, and that you're able to control that propagation of change as it comes through. So
Yeah.
is React reactive? Yes. Can you use React to do the same things that you can do with RxJS? No, you cannot. Can you use RxJS to do the same things you do with React? Maybe, but not without JSX and some other stuff, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that's really just because observables are so low level. It'd be a nightmare if you did it. It would probably be the worst thing you've ever done in your life. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think React is reactive, reactive enough, and Angular is reactive if you use it that way, and if not, it's just kind of convention based. Like
Yeah.
it knows, oh, you set a property on this, therefore I need to update, or it knows, oh, an event occurred, therefore I need to do some dirty checking.
Yeah.
Or you've turned that off and you're using reactivity to power everything. So
Yeah. So my very first Angular app, X many years ago, I think X is probably like 5 or 6 now. But I wasn't aware of RxJS yet. Just like taking an intro course on Angular, I was just like making things happen. And we built this like shopping cart app that was based on like the forms people would have and compare it against like what the server state was. And we'd like highlight things in the DOM that were changed. So highlight changes and have like a little shopping cart thing at the top showing you how many changes there were. I was doing this all via the do check hook, which was awful. Like the lifecycle hook, which was just like checking those forms, checking against our server state, and
right.
it felt at the time it felt kind of reactive. I don't think I'd say that now, but like the app itself was reactive. The code was imperative though, not declarative. I wonder. I always think of things in that distinction. Like reactive would describe the behavior. You'd use either declarative or imperative to describe like the coding paradigm used to implement.
Right.
Is that fair, or is there a reactive paradigm somewhere out there?
There's I think that you're half the way there, and
Uh-huh.
like the declarative bit is like what you're missing is the ability for the code to process or deal with the propagation of change and the propagation of data in a step-by-step basis where each step has no idea what happened in the step before. It just knows that it got something and it reacts to it and sends it along to the next step. And the next step has no idea what happened before it, and it just kind of, reacts to whatever it gets, right? So,
Right.
and that's the thing with if you have a function that accepts an observable of strings, for example, it doesn't care if it got those strings from an HTTP call or if it got it from a button click or mouse movements or an interval or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just going to react to whatever you get. And you could even mix those things together and it's still just going to react to whatever you get. And so that to me is the only piece you're kind of missing about reactive programming. Now, what you're seeing is it's event based. And so there's an event that occurs and then you do something to trigger yet another event and then handle that elsewhere. But like, you kind of have this thing where it doesn't really know what happened to the event, but you kind of do, but you kind of don't, because you have to very explicitly say, oh no, the next event is this thing.
Yeah.
Or you have to explicitly do something that happens to trigger the next event or whatever. There's some slight intertwining of that, and it's not also non-obvious the control flow.
Yeah.
Right in there, like you don't see it listed as steps that you can interchange or anything like that. It's more just like by convention, this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Which arguably you could say that's true about React and their render cycle, and like this component renders, then this component renders, and this component renders. But then by the same argument, you can go back and look at the JSX and be like, well, I knew this was going to happen right after this because I composed it this way. So, I don't know. it's a fuzzy world. Like so the other thing people don't understand is like there's more different types. So usually people talk about reactive in forms of like push, but there's pull based reactivity
Yeah.
where you say, oh, I need this value, and the value is computed from something else, which is computed from something else, which is computed from something else, and then gets the original state. And then there's, like a push pull where there's a notification and then you have to pull it and it goes through and it does the computation. And then there's the other way around where, you pull to see if there's anything you should get or whatever. I'm sorry, let's think about this. There's the other way around where you pull and you get like this is like an async iterable that we have in the browser now, where you pull and it says, oh, here's a promise that something's going to happen. And then it pushes at you, and then you react to it. So like there's a variety of different ways to go about this. The two simplest being push and pull, and I would argue that the most powerful and flexible is probably just push because of the simplicity of it and the fact it can schedule things a little differently or delay things a little differently. The push pull and pull push are the ones that can help you with things like back pressure and that sort of thing. So they all have their place. I don't know. And I'm going to rant for just a second about this. Like we have pull in the browser. We've got like iterators and these other things. We've got pull. We have pull push because we have async iterators, which is good enough to be similar to push pull, like in my opinion, but we do not have just simple push, which would be observables. Like we've got a simple push of one, which is promises, but it's so hard to argue that point and get people to listen on these committees. Just very excited about promises and async await and that sort of. At least that's been my experience in the past. So
yeah. No, I've felt that way too. One of the things I wanted to ask you too was specifically observables versus promises. I remember RxJS Live before all COVID happened. Kapehe had a great talk on this, like comparing the two. That was really neat. And it seemed like from her stance, the verdict was kind of promises are. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but it felt like the reason promises are still around is because they're standard. Everything else observables do better at. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, there's use cases where a promise is exactly the right thing. For example, if you are like on a server or something like that, where you were like, oh, so you sent me this request, and I'm guaranteeing there has to be a response. Like a promise is reasonable for that. Like on the server side, on the client side, not so much because sometimes you want to abort them. But like on the server side, you're talking about a situation where you're guaranteeing a response. And so if you ever have something that's going to asynchronously push something at you, and you want to guarantee that it's either going to succeed or fail, and you're never going to cancel it, promises for you. It's perfect for that. Where it sucks is in the more general, because it's promises a higher level type than observable. Observable is very low level. You can build a promise from observables, but you cannot build observables from promises because promises are scheduled. They can't be synchronous. Promises are only one value. They can't give you zero or many values, and promises cannot be canceled. So there's a lot of rules around promises, where observables, like there's no rule. Like you don't have to. You could write an observable that didn't implement the teardown, and like, guess what? Now you can't cancel the stuff underneath it. I don't care. You're not going to get the data out of it, but like the stuff, like the WebSocket, whatever, it's still running. That's what I wanted, right? Like you can do that. But you can't. I mean, you have the option to also tear it down, where like the promise, there's no option to stop it. Like if you do stop it, you have to reject it. It has to be an error. Like any canceled promise has to error the end. So it's got more limited use cases than observables, but that doesn't mean the use cases don't exist. Or that it's not the right thing. For example, it works really well as the return value for each from observable. because for each is a non-cancelable way to subscribe to an observable. So you're guaranteed to get a completion or an error. Like you're not going to miss on that. So perfect for that use case. However, like subscribe, doesn't work because you can cancel it and then you don't get an error or a complete. So yeah, I don't know. They are, in my opinion, and I know I've said this enough that I'm sure I'm not hurting anybody's feelings because I'm sure they just disagree with me, but they're poorly designed, and it's unfortunate. But it seems like most people get by and they use them. The real problem I see with promises is people are like, oh, I've got these promises, and they'll compose like then, or like they'll have worse than that. They'll be like new promise, and inside new promise they've got other promise, then resolve, then resolve, reject, resolve, and they've got like these weird things, and they end up with crazy memory leaks and like lots of processes that are just running, and they don't realize that it's still going after they no longer care about the stuff. Or they'll write an async await. I've seen actually an async, like I had to debug a race condition on a server where they wrote an async await. It had 30 awaits inside of it.
Oh my gosh.
And under different branches of code, like so under different code paths. So they had like conditionals, right? And so what would happen is and each one of those had side effects. So 2 calls would come into the server and they would be racing each other through the same method, and there was no way, like, there's no concat map that you can slap on that to make sure that it's only doing one of those at a time, which ironically that was the fix, was to be like, okay, well, I'm going to take all these requests and I'm going to put them through this subject and then take the whole async await function and stick it in the concat map so I know that like there's only one thing going through this at the same time,
right?
But yeah, like that was the quick fix anyways.
Yeah.
So that I see people messing this up a lot. They don't realize that after every await you need to check a bit to see if you've canceled it or not. They don't realize that like 2 things could call this, and now like this inside you're actually racing each other inside of this one, what seems like one function, but it's not. It's multiple function contexts, and so it's just crazy thing. And then I don't know if you saw my tweet. It's like a week ago about
I've been off Twitter for like a week, so I'm afraid I missed it.
So I learned something fascinating. A week ago where if you create a new error in JavaScript and you hold on to it in Chrome anyways, in V8, in order to build the stack, like the .stack property on the error, it holds on to everything that's in scope wherever that new error was created, even if it has nothing inside of you. You're not saying new error, stick this big thing in my error. You're just saying new error and nothing, and then just handing it off to something else. And then everything else in that scope could fall out of scope, but it doesn't matter. It will be retained in memory until someone calls.
So that error gets garbage collected?
Weirder. Yes. If the error gets garbage collected, that'll do it.
Okay.
But also, if you say error.stack and actually read the stack,
it's like an actual queue.
It uses the information in there to tokenize the stack, and then it garbage collects everything it was holding on to that was in scope. So it's nutso. Like I even proved it. So like you can get these. So here's where promises come in.
Yeah.
If you reject a promise, it has to delay. It has to schedule in order to like deal with an error. So when you say reject new error, everything else that's in scope in there is trapped in memory until that thing. So like then people will do this thing where they use promise as a caching mechanism, right?
Yes, I've seen that a lot.
So they'll be like, oh, I'm going to stick this promise. I have like this let whatever. I'm just going to stick a promise in it, and then I'll use that whenever I want. If you happen to have a rejection and you stick it in there, and you never read the stack on the error inside that rejection, then everything that was in scope whenever that error was created, no matter what it is, even if it should be long, should be long dereferenced, it's held in memory because you've held on to that promise. So
that's crazy.
it's totally nuts. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's this thing weird. There's these really really weird foot guns that are related to promise that people don't quite, and that's kind of
Yeah.
a foot gun related to the V8 specific implementation of an error,
Yeah.
but like the fact that people use promises as a caching mechanism kind of make that happen. Like you can't do that with an observable. There's
Yeah.
no like observable's not gonna. I mean, you in theory you could like you could compose the
Behavior
behavior into
subjects.
them. Yeah, but like just a basic observable, you're not going to be able to do that
Yeah.
accidentally. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting stuff.
If you wanted to, you could manage it though. Yeah, yeah. The one of the coolest things I thought was you had a talk a while back that you gave on where you live coded like implementing observables, and that was like such a great way for me to just understand. Okay, this is exactly what's going on. It's just function calls essentially happening, function calls and callbacks on the different events. Whereas promises like you got to go into the it's an actual mechanic. It's a new mechanic for promises, the micro event queue, which is hard enough to talk about, much less explain.
Right.
So yeah, interesting there. So one of the things I was thinking of especially though was like for Angular route guards are something I wish would not accept an observable because it's very confusing. I think a route guard accepting an observable would kind of suggest like you listen to the different events submitted by that observable, and you can maybe like kick someone out of a route once it's already been activated based on some future event that might emit, which is not the case. I always got to look into it. It's always taking the first thing emitted and then stops listening at that
Right.
point, which is just kind of like that was one of my things is like you get into observables, there's so many dimensions to this, and for stuff like this you kind of have to look into some implementation detail to see, and it's hard to even put that in
Right.
a comment, I
You
feel
know,
like.
like I think that you know the language is missing like a single value observable. Really,
Hmm.
like if promise was written the way that it in my opinion should have been written, it would have been lazy,
Yeah.
and it would just be a single value, and the combination of those two things would have made it more useful for a specific use case like a route guard, and actually lots of specific use cases more
Yeah.
useful for
HTTP
you know
requests.
HTTP requests and all sorts
Yep.
of things where, or even there's various events that happen, like you've got like a WebSocket on close or a WebSocket
Yeah.
on air or something like that. It's just like one, you're only going to get one, and we know it's only
Yeah.
going to be one. So if we return this type to you that is lazy, that you subscribe to it, but you know you're only going to get one, then there you go. And
Yeah.
like for something like that, it would have been perfect.
Yeah. My friend Rarish sent me some stuff. I think it's like a third party thing on top of RxJS that kind of gives you more type information on this kind of stuff. Like, is it hot versus is it cold? Does it only emit once and then immediately complete? I don't have the name of the package, but I'll make sure I put it down in the comments for anyone listening. So
Yeah, there's some interesting work that Moshe and Nicholas have done on the RxJS team that they did it. They actually talked about this at RxJS Live, but basically the work was like, can we get traits of observables into the type system
hmm.
in a like a seamless way where you don't really realize it happens. So you can be like, okay, of 123 dot take 5, and it can be like, hey, you can't take 5 here
Yeah,
because there's
that would
only
be
three
so cool.
values. So
Yeah.
like there's been some work around that. Now the problem is like, you know, what happens if someone really wanted to do that for some reason? Like you don't want to give them a build error.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a better lint rule or something. So
Hmm.
there's some fuzzy ground around that, but there's some interesting work that's been done around that. And even in the past, like older versions of RX5, we had things that said, you know, is this scalar?
Yeah.
Is this an observable of 1? And if it is, then just like reach in and pull the value out and send it.
Yeah.
And since then, those optimizations, a lot of it have gone away because V8's gotten so much faster that those weren't really helping us. But
Yeah.
you know, there's just there's been thought pointing that direction. The truth is, like, if we did have like a single value observable, like the dancing you might have to do around, what works and what doesn't with those things, like in the additional complexity when people are already freaked out about observables. Like,
Hmm.
I don't know if like our user base is super ready for that. Like,
Yeah.
well, we have tasks now, and we also have observables, and they're both the same thing, but tasks are only one. And like, like I could just
Yeah.
see people melting down over
Yeah.
it. Like,
I feel like working with RxJS, one of the things that's most helpful is to try to flatten it down a little bit to remove some of those levels of complexity. Um, so yeah, I don't know. And this maybe gets into another question I had, because you were talking about how promises are always eager, right? And you'd like to see them lazy by default.
yeah,
Um, and it kind of gets into
which
like,
is never going to happen, right?
yeah,
That ship
it's
has
gone.
sailed. But yeah,
But in an alternate timeline, maybe we could go back and fix
right.
things. But like,
If I build a time machine.
yeah, hot tub time.
So because the first thing I'm going to do if I have a time machine isn't like anything interesting. It would be going back and stopping bad decisions in JavaScript. Like, it wouldn't be
Oh,
like
Bubble, we
I'm
love
going to
this.
go make a bunch of money on the stock market, or I'm going to get a bunch of winning lottery tickets or something. It's going to be
Yeah,
like, you know what? I'm going to fix that promise issue.
yeah.
Iterators is next. Yeah, I can
I got my eye on
yeah.
you,
All right.
generators. Yeah, but yeah. So, promises, the way the world we're in now, the world we find ourselves in, they're hot, but we can kind of make them cold. We can kind of make them lazy by making a function that returns a promise.
Right.
Right, and that's something I see a lot. Like, you call that like a promise factory, I think, or something like that. I
Yeah.
think that works relatively well. I was actually curious if this ever came up for observables. Was this ever considered to just make observables eager, but have this way of just calling the function to make them lazy? It's kind of what we do with subscribe,
It's
but
early on when I first started looking at this during the
yeah.
earlier days of the TC39 proposal. I do think it came up. I believe it was immediately like shut down though, because there was like that. It removes a lot of the usefulness to do that,
Okay.
and part of that is like you don't get that kind of monadic, like this is in a wrapper sort of behavior. Like you don't get to something where you can like take it and make another thing that's of the same shape and then later on unwrap it whenever you need to. Like it's already being unwrapped when it's handed to you. So
Yeah.
that comes with its own set of issues. There's issues that are similar to the issues that Promise has, right?
Right.
So I think that's the real reason that you don't see that. And then like of course the other way around where you're talking about like factories that return observables, that's a fairly common practice. But sometimes, like if you have a factory that takes no arguments and returns an observable, you probably just have the observable. Like you
Yes.
probably don't need to create a new instance of it every time. But
I
depending on the
agree.
observable, I mean, sometimes it's a factory that returns like a hot observable that's different every time, right? But
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've played around with some. I don't think I actually would do this actually, but like playing around with the Angular HTTP client, like changing get to an operator instead of a method on a service,
mm,
um, as, just as something interesting. But it definitely, like, going through the learning process of RxJS. Definitely, the creating calling that function, in my mind, the mental model was, okay, this is hot now, and that was not the case, and it threw me for a loop a couple times, right? To just understand what was going on there, and once I got it, I
yeah.
got it. But it was definitely like one of those things I was considering. I was wondering if it was like for cancelability that you'd want that. Um,
Uh, Generally speaking, yeah. Like like if you have something that's eager, as long as basically whenever the eager thing is created,
yeah,
that's when you have to hand your cancellation mechanism to it, right? Like
right.
you can't if it's eager, like whenever that thing happens, like whenever you say new promise or whatever, that's the moment that you need to be like, oh, and I already have my cancellation mechanism. It's right here. So I
Yeah,
can tear down whatever's happening during the setup process. Otherwise, you know, it's so I will say this about eagerness in defense of eagerness of promises. like people do have a hard time understanding laziness. And I don't know if it's just because promises are have trained them into thinking, oh, this is already underway.
Yeah.
But like for some reason, when they're like, I called a function, you gave me an observable, like in their head they think
Yeah.
things are happening now, like, and
Yeah.
it's
Well,
like, well,
you call HTTP client.get and you think you made a
right,
GET request. So
yeah.
makes
And
sense.
so, I mean, it would, if there was some syntax that made observables look more like a function, that would be cooler, because then I think it'd be easier for people to understand, like, oh, I called a function, I got a function. Clearly that function's not doing anything. It's a function.
Yeah.
Like, but it's not, but then, people have a hard time with functional programming in general, like higher
Yeah.
order functions melt some people's minds, which is understandable. It's totally fine. But like,
Yeah.
that's our job is hard, right?
Yeah.
But in higher order functions, functional programming by itself, particularly with TypeScript, weirdly, is a very, very powerful thing.
Yeah.
And people are doing it a lot and they don't even realize they're doing it. Like, when you create a class and it has methods on it, realistically, what you're doing is you're creating an instance of an object
Mm-hmm.
and then a whole bunch of other function instances that when you call them
Yep.
are like, partially applied to send that instance of an object as like the this argument, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's, it's kind of splitting hairs. I don't understand why some people reason about classes so well, but they have a hard time reasoning about higher order functions. But
Yeah.
here we are.
No, I just like, well, I hadn't got into stuff until classes were already a thing. But I just like that they're around. I think that just having, well, especially with the advent of TypeScript, having TypeScript around closures just feels like a more natural way, and that's much more functional way, I think,
Right.
of
Right.
getting this kind of stuff. But
Well, I mean, even at a low level, I mean, what you're doing is you've got some state and you're executing some subroutine on it, right? Like, so you've got basically, like you've got state, you've got some like variables or whatever, and you've got functions you want to execute. And if you look at like a method on a class, the variables are being passed in either as arguments, as closure, or as part of the this context, right?
right,
And you could change the source of any of those or even all of those to be nothing but arguments, or you could change all of those to be nothing but closure
yeah,
by like monkeying around with how you set up the whole thing, but it would still be the same function and it's still acting and doing the same things.
yeah,
It's just, doing it all in closure would be nutso, right? Because then you'd have to, I don't know, set some global state and then call the function or something. But like at the end of the day, the fundamental difference between like a higher order function that executes something and saying new class, which is you're calling a function that then returns a set of functions and you're calling those. Like the fundamental difference between saying new class and then calling methods on it, or calling a higher order function then calling the function it returns,
yeah,
basically nothing. Like,
Yeah.
but for whatever reason, people see the higher order function. They're like, oh my god, it's a parenthesis with an arrow pointing at a parenthesis. What does that mean? And you're like, okay, relax.
calm down.
Yeah, it's okay. If I rewrote this as a class, would it be okay? Oh yeah, that's better. Okay, I get that.
Now I got it.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, let me ask you this. This is latching on to something you said towards the beginning, where you said RxJS is really good for the limited use cases like streaming and things that need cancellation. I use RxJS in Angular everywhere. If I have a property in Angular that's going to change, I use an observable because it gives me a way of writing declarative code for how that property is going to change. I love this because as a contractor, you get dropped into these 2,000 line components where you got to track where each one of these properties changes. You got to kind of like, I feel like a madman, like with my whiteboard, drawing the map of how these things work out, and switching it to then this declarative code where here's a logical chunk in my mind. This is a logical chunk. This is how that name property is going to change. How it's ever going to change is defined by things that actually affect it, and that seems so much more better to me, to the point where I've been experimenting recently with just vanilla JavaScript. How can this work with RxJS and just using like the DOM manipulation API kind of to mess around with things. And I think it works very well, like to the point where I go through the steps. I kind of use TypeScript, define my types, set my constraints. I write some functions to make observables or operators or however I'm getting to it. I get into my observables at the end of the day. I can see where each little piece is going, and then managing the subscriptions myself is actually more of a pain than I thought it would be. Like it's made me really appreciate the async pipe a lot. Just to do this and be able to drop async pipe in some HTML template. That's really cool, especially going around and reverse engineering this from scratch. But it is kind of cool to see what you could do with subscriptions and subscribing specifically to certain things in certain places.
I think one of the places that modern frameworks have kind of failed us all a little bit is whenever you get to like the thing that there's a couple of things that modern frameworks all provide that people take for granted or don't really realize. Like when it comes to like, oh, I want to react to something and update a view, you can just use something like, hell, you could use event targets for that. You don't even need to use RxJS, but you can use something like RxJS for that. You don't need a framework if that's all you're doing. But like component composition is a hard to solve problem, especially when you're talking about like lists and like for each type behavior or whatever.
Well, I feel like I'm reverse engineering virtual DOM when I do some of this stuff.
Right. So it becomes apparent very quickly if you try to make these things yourself and you want to be able to make components that you can kind of plop into other components and do things like that. That's the hard part that frameworks solve. But the place that and the other thing that frameworks give us is a certain amount of life cycle. Like it knows when like the root component of the root DOM element of a component has been mounted and when it's unmounted, and you act on these things. But the spot where it's kind of failed us, in my opinion, is that piece where it says, oh, I want to, like, I'm now unmounting, and they always just give you like, okay, here's a function I'm going to call. There you go. You do whatever you want in that. Yeah. And like one of the most powerful feature of RxJS that people forget about or take for granted is the automatic teardown. So you know everything that you've got set up inside of like your concat maps and your switch maps and whatever's going on, like however complicated it is, if it's all chained together and you call unsubscribe, boom, it's going to tear everything down and clean up memory.
Yep.
And
are you talking about the complete callback in your subscription?
I'm talking about just when you call subscribe or unsubscribe, like whenever or when it errors, when it completes, or when it unsubscribes, it's guaranteed to tear down resources under the hood.
Gotcha.
So like unsubscribe would be like, it's the thing that you always have to put in your ng on destroy, or in your component, on will and mount or component will and mount or whatever in React. Like you have to do this unsubscribe. And I think that the fact that there's these ng on destroy and these other things, and no one's like, you know what, here's an abort signal, or here's like this token that everyone uses the same shape thing that tells you when this is going to tear down, and you can register whatever you want with it to tear other things down. Like, I think that's been a failure on the part of every framework out there. And instead they're just like, well, we got to do this function. You just imperatively wire up whatever. Yeah. And then people screw that up and cause memory leaks all the time where, if there was just something that was more baked in, like when this happens, here's this token that you can hand to everything else. And as long as everyone's libraries implement, something around this token, then it works. So one of the things I'm really watching is like abort token. Abort token's in the DOM now. It's in Node. And that's like the two primary. So like we should be able to start using abort token and abort controller to cancel everything, but the ergonomics around it still kind of suck. Like it's not, per the usual for DOM APIs, right? Like it's got, it's using like add event listener, remove event listener. You only ever really want it once, but add event listener now will accept an abort signal. It's coming soon to a browser near you. I don't think it's deployed yet, but it's been merged, is my understanding, at least as part of the spec. And so the idea is you won't need to remove event listener anymore. You can just give it an abort signal. Yeah. And when someone aborts it, it'll tear down. And then
That's really
RxJS,
cool.
we're going to move to be using abort signal inevitably instead of subscriptions, but it's
Hmm.
going to be a long road to get there. So many people are using subscriptions. We can't just change
Yeah.
that overnight. But yeah, like we'll be able to, you'll have an abort signal that you're using for all sorts of other things. And you just pass that same thing like a token to every subscription, and it, just works, and there won't be any concerns. But like there's on the Angular side of things, because so many people use the pipe, that would mean that Angular is going to have to manage their own abort token. I don't know if they'll really like that. So
Yeah.
again, it's something we're going to have to put off, and what we definitely want to have it, but there might be some dual mode for a while where it's like, oh, you can use subscriptions or you can use an abort signal.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean technically we already have that with like from fetch, right? Like you can pass an abort signal in there, but not as part of the subscribe contract or as part of the for each contract or something like that.
Gotcha. Cool, Ben. Well, thanks so much for your time. We're about at the end of our time right now. I just
Yeah,
wanted
yeah.
to take
Thanks for
some
having
time
me.
to say thanks so much for what you do in terms of managing this library, and I definitely have benefited a whole lot from all the hard work you've done. So, from the bottom of my heart, thanks, Ben.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Of course, man. See y'all. Catch you next time.
See you.